For example, in Australia, the amount of water that you would need to fill every single pumped hydro that Australia has projected it might need, say 20,000 megawatts of pumped hydro in Australia, that would only require 1/10 of the amount of water that all the thermal stations use in a year. Relatively, it's a tiny amount of water. Ho, which is near me here, is 500 megawatts and 14 hours storage. And yet the storage reservoir at Splityard Creek is about 1/100th of the total storage of the Wivenhoe Dam, which is mainly for flood mitigation and water supply. So on a relative scale, the amount of water that we need is tiny. And then the other thing that's increasingly of interest, and I recently gave presentations at a conference in the US and also in Canada, is repurposing mine pits. And one of the projects which is under construction in Queensland is a project called Kidston, and that's 250 megawatts with 8 hours storage. And that's using a pair of gold mine pits where those pits are being mined out. And so there's a lot of interest in that because it means that you're using an area that's already disturbed. Therefore, you don't have to put a barrier on a river. But that's the other thing about pumped hydro as well, is that you can go offstream. You don't have to be on a river. In fact, very often you'll find better sites off rivers rather than on rivers, because if you can imagine, rivers follow the easiest path, and the easiest path may not be the most direct path. And yet for pumped hydro, we want to get to the most direct path between the upper reservoir and the lower reservoir. So it's not surprising at all that these off-stream pumped hydro schemes very often much better schemes than if you dammed the river and tried to build on the river. And so consequently, it's very much easier to permit those smaller schemes. The other thing that's happening as well, particularly true in the US, people are starting to look at some of the very old conventional hydro schemes, many of which were quite small, 20, 30, 40 megawatts, but they involve quite large reservoirs. And so people are starting to have a look at those same sites and saying, if we put in a pumped hydro, it could be 10 or 20 times bigger for using the same inundation area because you're using the water. Look, there's renewed interest, both because we need storage, but also because we're thinking that it's no longer acceptable, as you point out, to flood an area and displace very large numbers of people and disrupt the morphology of a river and the biology of the river as well. So it's focused attention in a different direction. I don't know whether you can see the background behind me there, that beautiful piece of river there. And that was going to be dammed for irrigation. Fortunately, that project didn't go ahead, but we are going ahead with a pumped hydro, which is more or less offstream. It's downstream of an existing dam, which has already disrupted the flow. And so we're making use of a piece of the river that's already been impacted by irrigation and avoiding having to flood a beautiful area like that behind me.
And then most of these pumps will be using floating solar. Is that a fair assumption during daytime to pump back?
It probably won't be floating solar because in Australia, we have a lot of land area and we also have a growing interest in co-location of terrestrial solar with grazing animals on the same area that the solar is built. And that's very cost effective, and the farmers like it because they get better returns from their grazing land because less evaporation, shelter for their animals. And so solar from those installations is very cheap. We've also got a surplus now in Australia very often of rooftop solar. Because something like a third of houses in Australia now have solar. If you're like me, you try and use it to charge your EVs, but you always have some left over. And so that's got to go somewhere. So increasingly, we're looking to use that for pumped hydro.
Okay, that's good. So you're saying for Australia, at least, all the pump hydros are either getting rooftop solar or you have agrovoltaic. Fantastic.
And of course, they can also use wind. So Snowy Hydro has got a long-term contract to buy wind as well as solar, and it uses that to offset its conventional hydro, but also to support its pumped hydro. So, yeah, you'll see more of those sort of deals happening as well, I think.